is Hamza the Linguist. As you can see, I'm filming while driving. I've been incredibly busy lately. Trying to start basically more than one business. I'm moving to a new apartment, so I got a lot going on, to say the least. And then I got a 2-year-old son at the same time who doesn't want to let me sleep that much. So, very busy, and feel kind of not as productive as I want to be because I'm sleepy all the time. And I've been kind of sick this week, so hasn't been the best, but making the best of it. So it's almost sundown. Traveling right now. I'm driving, I don't know, 70 or 80 miles. The sun's about to set, so it may get a little bit dark, but someone had requested that I made a video on the Arabic alphabet, or the Arabic script, because they're learning, I think it was Persian and Urdu, and some other languages that, you know, out there use the Arabic script, or can be written with the Arabic script. So just kind of, instead of doing like a traditional video, you know, where you go and I get my whiteboard out, you know, and write on that and show you, you know, this is this letter, this is that letter. The viewer, subscriber asked for, like, you know, some cool ways to remember each letter. So I figured, hey, why not do it while I'm driving, and I'll try to edit in some cool letter or something, you know, here, and then you guys have something a little bit different. And I found personally, now you guys, you know, people could debate me. Everyone learns different, but personally, I find that, like, if someone explains something in depth to me or gives me a lot of, like, background information about it, I don't easily forget it. And so, because I think, you know, you're building more connections in the brain, you have more things associated with it. So I figured I'd talk in depth, you know, about kind of the Arabic script and the history of it and each letter, and as much as I can, you know, just blab along, because I feel like that, you know, when someone takes that approach with me, I don't forget things. Part of the reason too why I really like historical linguistics and etymology and these things too. Whenever I learn a new language, I'm not only interested in learning how to communicate and how to speak with people, but I want to learn the culture. I want to learn the history of the language. How did this language develop? Where did this language come from, so to say? You know, why is this word the way it is? You know, how is this word pronounced before? You know, you're gonna have different dialects in language. Some dialects stick to the older form of the language sometimes. Like, for instance, you have in Turkey a minority of Greek speakers, and they've spoken Greek there for, you know, forever. And before the Ottomans, before the Turks came into the Anatolian Peninsula, and the form of Greek that they speak is actually much closer to ancient Greek than what they speak in Greece. So, you know, things like that I find pretty interesting. So with the Arabic language, first of all, it's a Semitic language, and Semitic also falls under a bigger branch or bigger family called the Afro-Asiatic. So I kind of want to talk about that for a little while. And, you know, I could be totally wrong, so if I'm totally wrong, you know, please correct me on some issues, or if you disagree, you know, feel free to comment below on some things. But so the Afro-Asiatic family, I think, is a really interesting one. It's one that I kind of do a lot more research on. And as we know, that linguistics like historical linguistics or languages are languages passed down from generation to generation. And so usually you'll see historical linguistic evidence correlate with genetic evidence, with DNA, and it'll also correlate with archaeology. And I think we really find this particularly with the Afro-Asiatic language group. Now, as far as I understand it, I'm speaking totally from memory here, from just research that I've done in university. But it's about 20,000 years ago is when there was a distinct group that we could call the Afro-Asiatic group, or tribe, maybe you might want to call it. And all the DNA and archaeological evidence, as well as the linguistic evidence, they all come together really well with this group, and they point to the fact that this group lived in what we call modern-day Sudan. Now it's split up to North and South Sudan, but I guess the area kind of combined. And back then it was a lot more lush. There was a lot more greenery, a lot better environment for human beings to live in. And a lot of the scientists theorize, archaeologists rather, they theorize that something changed in the climate pretty quickly and caused the people to start migrating. And so you had a good chunk of the Afro-Asiatics going north, and they ended up conquering what we consider to be modern day Egypt, and they ended up becoming the pharaonic class. Okay, so basically they were the pharaohs. They were these people who came and conquered ancient Egypt, and they looked different than the indigenous Egyptians. And you also had a group that stayed in kind of the area of what we call Sudan. Then you had a major portion of this Afro-Asiatic group that went south, and they ended up conquering what we call Ethiopia and Somalia today. And then some of the Afro-Asiatics, they went out and beyond Egypt, and they went into the Middle East. So you have this kind of dichotomy there a little bit, where you have like the north and southern Afro-Asiatic languages and peoples. And so the ones who went south, some of them settled in what we call northern Ethiopia today, and those are the Amharic people. They speak the language Amharic, which is actually really quite similar in a lot of ways to Arabic. It's considered Semitic language. I think like their biggest Christian denomination there, they call it like the Tawheedo Church, which is very, very similar to the Arabic word Tawheed, and they both have the same meaning, to unify, or to make one. And then, I have a friend who's actually Amharic, and, I ask him questions about his language a lot, and I met, Amharic people when I was in university, students and such, and, a lot of the words are almost exactly identical to Arabic, like the word bait, meaning house, and other things like that, completely identical. And then, some of the Afro-Asiatics kept pressing more south, and that's where you get the Oromo people, which are in modern-day southern Ethiopia. And Oromo is Cushitic language. This is where the Kushites started to come about. And the Kushites, now is modern-day Oromo and Somali language. Their languages are, Oromo and Somali are very related. They have a lot of words that are identical, like they both use the word ano for milk, and many words are exactly the same. I have a lot of friends who they're half Oromo, half Somali, and they speak both languages fluently. And so I like to talk to them and, pick their brain a little bit and ask them, like what words are the same or almost identical, what's different and those types of things. And it's really, they're similar languages. I find them to be both very beautiful languages. I really like those languages. And so about 4,000 years ago, you had a chunk of the Oromo break off and invade the Horn of Africa, and those are the people we call the modern-day Somalis. And what we do know about the Somali culture 4,000 years ago is that probably the most prestigious people in Somali society, and these were tribal society. It's very basic, tribal society, I guess you could say. It's not a big organized civilization quite at this point yet. But the most prestigious person was the Waranle, or the warrior. And they had this warrior culture in the Kushites, especially the Somalis. And they basically conquered the Horn of Africa from the Bantu people, or basically what we nowadays might call the Swahili people. Mogadishu existed before the Somalis ever got to the Horn of Africa. It's a very, very old city. And the Somalis were able to conquer that whole entire, I guess you could say, Horn of Africa or peninsula or whatever you want to call it. And still to this day, you have a people in their society who they call Bantu. And most archaeologists, geneticists, even though they've never really done much of a DNA test that I know of, specifically on Bantu people, which is a shame. It'd be nice if we knew more about what's going on there. But they theorize that these were the indigenous people who were conquered by the Somalis. And unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, and people, they may disagree with me and whatever, but I've seen these things with my own eyes here in Minnesota. The Bantu people are basically considered the lowest people in society. They're treated the worst. Most Somalis, regular Somalis, I guess, if that's even the right way to say it, non-Bantu Somalis will not even marry a Bantu Somali. And usually it seems like the Bantu are very poor, very disenfranchised. There's like systematic racism against them or discrimination against them in Somalia. And so you don't see a whole lot of them ever really getting in any high place in society. And Somalia even today is very tribal, and it's kind of a shame. And there's movements, to combat that sort of racism or tribalism. I mean, tribalism basically is racism. There's ways they're trying to. There's a movement, especially from the Somali diaspora that's trying to stop this phenomena of tribalism and discrimination based on tribe. But so the Somalis with their warrior culture conquered this, and you have the Bantu people that are still there. Also, some people make the claim that some, slaves from West Africa might have been brought to Somalia and mixed in with the indigenous Bantu also. It's completely possible. That's why I wish we would there'd be more studies done on it, because Somalia and Ethiopia are very rich places for archaeological discovery, very rich places that pretty much for the most part undiscovered, I guess you could say, by modern Western science. But the history has been very well kept by a lot of the Somali historians. I've read books wrote by Somali historians, and a lot of this stuff really goes along with the archaeological, genetic, and linguistic evidence too. So it seems like we have a pretty well picture, or somewhat, of kind of the past for the Cushitic people. So now, going back to Egypt, you'll find even in ancient Egyptian language, the word for water, as far as I know, was bio, which is the exact same word that they use in modern Somali today. Furthermore, if we look at some of the ancient hieroglyphics in Egypt, they always refer to the land of Punt. Okay, and they said this is our homeland, or these are our ancestors. And the land of Punt, they discovered, after doing a lot of research and investigation, that, or they theorized, I wouldn't, maybe discover is not the right word, but they theorize pretty strong evidence that is what we now call modern day Puntland, or, you know, around that region, southern Ethiopia or the Horn of Africa. And when they did DNA tests and compared the Somali DNA and specifically Somali DNA to the pharaonic class, to DNA of pharaohs, they figured out that about, I think it was like 78% of Somalis carried almost like all the same huge genetic markers. So a lot of Somalis are pretty much very, very genetically related to the pharaonic class in Egypt. And, you know, nowadays when you see like ancient Egyptians portrayed on TV, they're basically like white people or, you know, slightly brown people or whatever. But the reality is they probably look more like Ethiopians and Somalis, or the North Sudanese. And from what I've heard, you know, of course I've never met anybody from this particular tribe, but in Egypt, and I've heard this from people who, you know, traveled to Egypt, that the pharaonic class or tribe still exists in Egypt. There is basically this tribe of dark-skinned people that look a lot like Sudanese or, you know, Ethiopians or Somalis, and they still speak a language that is very much related to ancient Egyptian, that is not Arabic and it's not Coptic, but it's a language that had evolved from ancient Egyptian, and they're still a tribe that I guess lives in Egypt. Whether this is true or not, I really don't have any strong evidence. Like I said, these are just testimonials that I've gotten from people who've been to Egypt, so I don't know how accurate that stuff really even is. So later on, what ended up happening is you had some other sub-Saharan Africans who came in and moved into what's modern-day southern Sudan. So the southern Sudanese, their languages are completely unrelated to the Afro-Asiatic language group, and genetically and archaeologically, they're not Afro-Asiatic at all, and that's why they look a lot different. And I've met a lot of Sudanese from both North and South Sudan, and I really love Sudanese people. I used to live with two Sudanese brothers. They were my roommates for a little while, and I loved them very much, and they're very, very awesome guys. And I really like Sudanese culture. I probably should have wore my Sudanese clothes. I got a Sudanese jalabiya at home. And I like the way they wear their turbans. But anyways, don't want to get too off track here, because now that I've covered kind of the Afro-Asiatic old history in Africa, when we go into the Middle East, you'll see that you know, languages like Hebrew and Phoenician and Aramaic and Arabic are considered under the Afro-Asiatic class or family. And some of them, like Arabic, really is kind of like a hybrid. And I'll get into that a little bit later. It's not exactly purely Afro-Asiatic. I'm trying to remember. I could be completely wrong, but man, I'm having like what we call a brain fart, or brain's not quite working. But the language of cuneiform, Babylonian, maybe. I believe that was an Afro-Asiatic language as well, but I could be totally wrong. I never really did a whole lot of research into it, because I mean, that's getting real ancient now. But these languages, that Afro-Asiatic languages that went into the Middle East, really developed this 3-letter root system. The Semitic languages, they all have this 3-letter root system going on. You find it in Hebrew, you find it in Arabic, you find it in Aramaic, and in Phoenician, and the likes. And so the whole language revolves around these consonants, and typically each word had three consonants that held the meaning of the word. And so to go in like the past tense, or like ed in English, like stop or stopped, you would basically, it would sound something like kataba. Okay, it's all kataba, which means, read. Or you could say kharaja, which means left or exited. You could say dhahaba, which means left, or he went away. Went, maybe is a better translation. That's another example. You could say batakha, which is cooked, and the likes. And then from that 3 consonant root is where all the other words of the language they are constructed by that base. You had different prefixes and suffixes and interfixes and circumfixes and different things like that, which became attached to these 3 consonants that gave more meaning. And the vowels, for the most part, they didn't contain a whole lot of meaning, although they do in some cases. They weren't that important. Usually people could infer what you meant, even if you didn't include the right vowels, or whichever. And even still, when I'm speaking Arabic today, sometimes I might leave out vowels, or maybe just because I'm not like native speaker at the language, I don't know what vowel goes there, so I just put one there, and they usually understand what I mean. And so out of these languages, the first that we know of, which came up with a writing system of the Semitic languages here, and I'm excluding cuneiform, but the first that we know of was Phoenician, and this is where you get the word phonetics, or phonetic or phoneme. And Phoenician, sorry, my camera's wobbling around here as I'm driving. Phoenician people created their own alphabet. From what I understood from taking a Middle East history course in university, the Phoenicians were a very seafaring people. They sailed a lot in the Mediterranean, and they moved a lot. They didn't really have, I guess you could say, a homeland, except maybe what we might call today as modern Syria, or maybe northern Israel, and maybe part of Turkey, southern Turkey, that kind of area, maybe where they might have lived. I'm not sure about the specifics, I'm not a historian, especially when it comes to Phoenicians, but they created like the first alphabet, and their alphabet is just consonants. Like I said, all the letters they have were letters representing the consonants, because that's what held the meaning, and that's really all you needed to read the word if you're a native speaker. And the Greeks and Roman, they basically took the phonetic alphabet or Phoenician alphabet. They took that and basically made it into their own, changed it and adapted it for their own purposes. But the special thing about the Phoenician alphabet is it was the first phonetic alphabet that we know of. Although I disagree with that, because I think the Somalis, they had an ancient script that they wrote Somali in that predates Phoenician, that it's clearly an alphabet to me, a phonetic alphabet, from the tablets, the inscriptions that I've seen, and from the linguistic knowledge that I have. It clearly looks like an alphabet to me, a phonetic alphabet, because before that they had basically like pictographs or hieroglyphs, and I'm not remembering the scholarly term at the moment, but you had syllabic symbols, like certain symbols that symbolized a syllable. And I think most notably you'll see this in ancient Mayan, and you also see this in ancient Egyptian, and cuneiform is also syllabic as far as I understand. And some Chinese characters even to this day are syllabic. They're there to tell you kind of like what sound to make, but they're not like a pictograph per se. And I think the most striking example with Chinese is the particle ma for question marker. So you could say like ni zhongwen ma, or no, ni zhongguo ma. It's like, are you Chinese? Put that ma at the end, it makes it a question. And basically what it is it's the character for horse, or rather it's, nowadays we call it as a character, but it evolved from an actual pictograph of a horse, and then they just put a little kind of square next to it to symbolize that we're just using the sound here, not the meaning. And so this phonetic alphabet from the Phoenicians was very groundbreaking, I guess is the way they describe it. And then the Hebrew, they developed their own writing system. The Aramaic developed their own writing system, I guess, based off the Phoenician, or maybe influenced by the Phoenician, or maybe they all kind of came about at the same time, just separately, but all at the same time as their civilizations or cultures developed together. I mean, for sure, they had to have interactions with each other, or influence with each other, you'd think. Whether it be directly or indirectly, or, even if they didn't live in the same time period, there's got to be some sort of influence there. And then the Arabs started writing their language a little bit later, and you can definitely see that there is some influence from Hebrew for sure. And I think a lot of that had to do with, there was a lot of Jews and Christians who spoke both Hebrew and Aramaic and those types of things, who constantly went down to the Arab Peninsula. And you had on the north part of the Arab Peninsula and in Syria and different places a lot of interaction with Arabic speakers and Aramaic speakers and Coptic speakers and Hebrew speakers and all of that. So I think undoubtedly the Arabic script is very influenced by those languages. And from what I was taught is that each Arabic letter used to be at one point like a pictograph or a symbol that meant a specific thing. And the meaning when you pronounced the letter, it meant something specific. And the only one that I can really remember off the top of my head right now was meme, which it literally was the symbol, and it meant, the word meme meant wine in ancient Arabic, like fermented grapes, in the very, very ancient Arabic. Now the modern Arabic is known as khamr, fermented grapes, like the alcoholic beverage khamr, and it used to be meme. And the Arabic language kind of, for the most parts, remained very pure, I guess, and because they were in the Arabian Peninsula, and not too many conquerors really tried to conquer them, and none of them ever really got to the inner parts of the Arabian Peninsula. It's a very barren place, like it's very hard to live, and there's nothing there that any world superpower had any interest in, because it's just empty desert in their eyes. So, the language didn't have a whole lot of, I guess you could say, outside influence to it, for the most part. And given the structure of Semitic languages, where they have this 3-letter root system, it's also very hard to take in loan words from other languages, because they can't just really take in a loan word because it doesn't fit into their grammar at all with this 3-letter root system or 3-consonant root system. They can't coin new words derived off of it, really. It's kind of a little bit more difficult. I mean, they do sometimes. People theorize that the word sultan, or what we say sultan in English, or sultan, is actually from Persian, perhaps. But that's debatable. I don't think I've ever heard of it ever being recorded in ancient Persian, but I could be totally wrong. Maybe there's some Persian people or people knowledgeable in Persian who could correct me. But they've always used the word Shah, as far as I understand, like Shah Isha, King of Kings, or the likes. And we know from basically the Bible and later on the Quran and a lot of archaeological evidence, kind of corroborates this, or it doesn't. Maybe it doesn't corroborate it, but it doesn't go against it, as far as I understand. I could be totally wrong. But basically, you had the prophet Abraham, peace be upon him, and he, as the story goes, that I'm summarizing here, he went to Egypt. He married an Egyptian lady. And Abraham, he was from Babylon, by the way, from, I believe, Nineveh, or I think in English that's Nineveh, and then basically northern part of Babylon at the time, Babylonian. And he came to Egypt, got married to Hagar, and basically went to the Arabian Peninsula, dropped her off there with his son Ishmael, and left them in what's known in the Bible as the Valley of Becca. Becca in Arabic language is a synonym for Mecca. Becca, I believe it's even in Quran. Becca, it literally means like the crowded place, because people would crowd at this valley, I guess. Perhaps a meeting place of some sort, I don't know. But anyways, so I'm assuming because Abraham had left them there, and people typically, they call your native language your mother language or mother tongue. We really learn a lot of language from our mother as kids. Mothers traditionally, and especially ancient societies, they were the ones who raised the children predominantly. They were the ones who stayed at home, and took care of the house and took care of basically spent most of the time raising the children. And the, adult males, the fathers, the husbands, they were typically out doing some sort of labor to make a living. And so, I would completely assume that Ishmael spoke very fluently his Egyptian mother tongue, and probably didn't know Babylonian that well, or if he might have knew some, but he wasn't very super fluent, being that he's, as far as I understand, was never in Babylonia, and probably only spoke it with his father. And then they ended up mixing with some Arab tribes coming out of Yemen, and they had been very isolated. Some people theorize that there was a land bridge between the Arab Peninsula and the Horn of Africa before, and so some Afro-Asiatic people had gotten into the Arabian Peninsula that way, instead of going through basically the, what do you call it now? Instead of going through Egypt, through the Middle East. Can't remember that piece of land there right now. And so, anyways, there's some Afro-Asiatic people that, were living in what we call today Yemen. And they traveled north and to the Valley of Becca and found this woman, Hagar, with her kid Ishmael. And they ended up forming a society together. And they say that, the modern Arabs, or the Arabs after that, came out of this mixture. And the language is kind of a mixture between this ancient Egyptian and the Arabic at that time. Furthermore, seems that the Arabs and the Ethiopians, the Eritreans, the Somalis, and these groups of people there, they had a lot of constant trade with each other and a lot of cultural exchange with each other. Seemed like they knew each other quite well, and when reading history. And even some of the kings of Ethiopia have tried to conquer the Arabian Peninsula. Usually they just ended up conquering Yemen. Sometimes they would try to get to Mecca, but it seemed like they failed every time. And that's where you get the story of Abraha trying to march elephants onto Mecca, but was defeated, and similar stories like that. So there's some background history, kind of, I guess, as much background history as I could give to the Afro-Asiatic languages. Sorry if I went kind of in depth and went for a long time there.